Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, a forbidden love gives way to gothic horror in the Shudder original, The Last Thing Mary Saw. In Southold, New York, 1843, Mary, played by Stefanie Scott, with a bloodied blindfold around her eyes, is questioned over the death of her grandmother, the matriarch, played by Judith Roberts. She tells her story and how she was in a secret relationship with the house's maid Eleanor, played by Isabelle Fuhrman, which her devoutly religious family viewed as a sin that must be severely punished and corrected. Determined to escape the cruelty of her family, Mary and Eleanor put in motion a plot that will have devastating and terrible consequences for everyone in the household. The Last Thing Mary Saw is the directorial debut of New York-based Italian filmmaker Edoardo Vitaletti, who previously had only made shorts up until this point. It premiered at Fantasia Fest last year in Canada, where it was soon snapped up by horror streaming service Shudder, who are releasing it as one of their originals, and it'll be released off their platform in a few months' time. And the movie definitely knows what it wants to evoke, because it definitely feels like The Witch meets Portrait of a Lady on Fire. And I'm not just saying that because that literally is in the PR materials, it's because that genuinely came to mind as I was watching it. And certainly those are two very high benchmarks to set yourself, and I'm not quite sure if the film fully attains that, but certainly it is an ambitious first feature. Full disclosure, this was something that I reviewed from a screener, but they have no input over this review, nor do they get to see it before I release it. Right from the outset, The Last Thing Mary Saw establishes itself as a strong critique of religious conservatism, where religion is used as the justification for cruelty and hypocrisy. This is evident from the framing device, where Mary is brought into the interrogation, and the first thing she has to do is that she has to recite the Lord's Prayer at gunpoint. Otherwise, she'll be shot for failing to do so. But this is nothing new for Mary, who's had to recite the Lord's Prayer so many times that she knows it back to front. So she recites it in an almost taunting fashion, especially the way that she gives an extended pause as if willing them to shoot her. This is a character that has not just lost her fear of her own religion that's been instilled, but also someone that has lost their fear of death, because it cannot take any more from them. In fact, far from it, she'd actually be very willing for that to happen. But the Mary that we see across the rest of the movie is a very different character that is still very much under the control of her family, itself under the thumb of its matriarch. The house in which the majority of the film is set is extremely isolated, which is only amplified by the closed-mindedness of its inhabitants. This is not a family that uses religion as a way of instilling love and benevolence. No, this one uses it as a way of control, as a way of instilling fear into each and every one of them, so they feel like they can't escape, and if they try to, or if they waver from their path, then that must be punished extremely severely. That is how they interpret God's will. So when they discover Mary and Eleanor's affair, it's treated as this enormous shame, as if it's something that would corrupt this household with sin, and clearly they're not the threat in this environment. The whole place is, the whole atmosphere that has been led down by the matriarch, played in a wonderfully sinister turn by Judith Roberts, who really, as a character, almost exudes a kind of menace about her, the way that she exacts these punishments upon the individuals in the household. There's something deeply malevolent about the matriarch and the power that she seems to exert over the rest of her family, even before the character reveals herself as being the most overtly supernatural element. And Vitaletti's direction reinforces this incredibly oppressive environment. His direction is extremely atmospheric, which is reinforced by the fact that the movie is shot almost entirely with very naturalistic lighting for the period, which is to say, most of the film is lit by candle, which means that this is a very dark looking movie. In fact, almost so much so that there were moments where it almost feels like key visual details are obscured by that darkness, but it gives you the sense that the family is surrounded by this evil which they apparently cannot see because it's been so ingrained within them, but also the fact that there is so much being hidden within this family, and that's also reinforced by a recurring visual motif of characters watching and stumbling upon Mary and Eleanor's relationship. Her little brother is often the one that's peeping through holes in floors and windows. It always feels like there's never a moment of privacy in that household. Even when the characters think they're alone, they are always being watched. They are always being observed in some way. There is always some grasp that is controlling them, even as they try to move out of it. And I feel like there is a definite creepy atmosphere that runs through the movie, and this gothic gloom is where the movie draws so much of its gradual tension from. The film is an extremely slow burn, in fact probably to the frustration of some horror fans, because this is not really about gory set pieces. If anything, it feels more like a bleak drama for much of the running time. Such are the horror elements downplayed into more of a constant, unsettling tone, and it's a film that demands your patience, almost to an agonising extent. Even myself, I think, found this movie to be quite hard to be fully engaged with, and around the midway point, I did start to waver somewhat from the film, because honestly, I feel like the horror elements here are actually too downplayed, and I wouldn't have minded exploring some of the more supernatural elements that are on the fringes of the movie, but aren't really fully gone into, especially the idea that the book that Eleanor carries around with her, actually inside of it carries the family's doom, that actually it's all been somehow foretold, and that's why they're so suspicious to a certain extent, and yet they're powerless to try and stop their fate and destruction, because actually they're so set in their ways that they're going to cause it by trying to fix it. That's an idea that I wouldn't have minded actually being made a bit more overt. At the centre of this movie you have this tragic romance between Mary and Eleanor, one that crosses lines of sexuality and class. And full credit to them, Stefanie Scott and Isabelle Fuhrman give two very solid performances in the lead roles. If anything, Fuhrman has the trickier of the two, given what happens to her character in the second half of the movie, and that she has to endure the very worst of the film's punishments. But they're both great in this movie, and I think you can see the differences in the two's personalities, given that they come from two different backgrounds, in that Mary is more of an innocent and she's somewhat naive. She's a bit more compassionate, given that this is her family, whereas Eleanor, who has suffered the worst of their punishments, she is much quicker to take extreme measures. The sadistic practices that Mary and Eleanor are forced to go through, far from correcting anything, instead only reinforces their desires and their attempts to escape from this tyranny, because it's who they are. They cannot change that, and a truly Christian household would be accepting of that fact and of their love. But these are dark, repressive times, although clearly the movie thinks that we're not as far removed from them as we like to think we are, because it does feel like a lot of these sequences are very thinly veiled allegories for modern day conversion therapy. So while we do have more progressive attitudes in the modern era, there is definitely something at the heart of America in parts of it that is much more oppressive, and certainly is a lot more closer to this kind of time period than we would like to admit. Also, the scenes that they do share are some of the best scenes in the movie, especially when the characters feel at their most uninhibited, when they're allowed to more freely express their emotions for each other. There is a tenderness to those moments, and I wish we got a couple of more instances of that, because it feels like they're so fleeting here. And there's also a bit of a sense, as I was watching this, that this kind of felt a bit overly familiar. It does feel like we have seen a lot of slow burn, relatively downbeat period lesbian romance movies recently. Not just Portrait of a Lady on Fire, but I'm also thinking of movies like Ammonite, for example, and this follows a lot of the tropes of those movies, and the only real difference between them and those is that The Last Thing Mary Saw is a horror film, so now there's an even greater emphasis on the characters suffering in a subgenre that's already couched in shame and pain, and I'm just kind of bored of this kind of story. It's not really a fault of the movie itself, it's just following its genre's conventions. I just want to see a period lesbian drama that actually had its characters feel joy for a change. I know it's not going to be this movie because it's a horror film, but what I will say is that it does feel like a lot of the horror here largely comes from the torturous punishments that Mary and Eleanor are forced to endure, and particularly memorably is the repeated image of the characters being forced to pray with their knees on rice, which gradually cuts into them to almost agonizing degrees. And that's a very memorable, striking image, but it's one the movie uses so often that after a certain point, I genuinely thought, I don't really think I'm learning any more from this. Have you got anything else to say other than just making me watch the characters howl in agony? But that's what the movie largely seems to do, and that's a shame because some of the horror images here are extremely striking, especially the very overtly supernatural ones. They're really kind of strange images here, but my prevailing memory of the movie is largely just characters being horrifically punished. This feeling is only amplified by the inclusion of Rory Culkin's Intruder, who enters into the film halfway through, a character that solely exists to add even more suffering and cruelty to a movie which wasn't exactly short on it in the first place. The character is identifiable by the fact that he has a very large birthmark on his face, and he has a very long monologue about how his family took him from doctor to doctor to doctor, trying to cure him of this ailment, and then eventually becoming convinced that it's a sign of evil and that they must kill him, which reinforces some of the themes of the film and the ideas of punishment within it, but also that because they treated him so badly, he became this monster that they claimed him to be, hence why the section of the movie where he enters is chaptered A Monstrous Birth. That's a direct quote from a line that he says in that speech. However, honestly, that feels largely like an apologia for writing this incredibly cliche character where someone shows up with a very obvious physical difference and then turns out to be heinously evil. And I feel like that is a character archetype. Weren't we trying to get rid of something like that? Weren't we trying to get rid of physically different and disabled characters being portrayed as somehow evil and heinous because of that? And yet it leans into that trope even as it tries to call attention to how harmful that stereotype is. That's kind of just having your cake and eating it in that case. And despite Culkin's best efforts, there's a character that could have been totally written out of the movie because all he does is periodically show up to do something horrible and then wander off screen again, and they vaguely imply he might be connected to something supernatural going on, rather than maybe just having something more interesting happen than indulging in a bunch of lazy, harmful stereotypes. However, the movie does recover in time for its big finale. If you're patient enough to wait for it, that final chapter is a satisfying payoff, especially because the horror elements finally come to the fore there, and I think that Vitoletti's direction is definitely at its strongest because it's essentially staged as one long extended scene, and so the first half of it is almost unbearably tense because you know what's going to happen, and then there's a very grisly punchline. It is remarkably brutal, that conclusion, and certainly there's almost a darkly comic element about it if it weren't for the fact that it's also extremely grim at the same time. And I think that Vitaletti knows how to stage an extremely striking image. There are definitely things from this movie that kind of burrowed into my head a little bit, especially the recurring motif of fingers, be them being severed or twitching in a coffin or turning black in a telltale way. There are definitely things that kind of haunted me, especially about the very closing moments of the film. I just wish it did so far more consistently. If you like moody, atmospheric horror films that feel like they could have been distributed by A24, The Last Thing Mary Saw could be for you, especially as it's a very handsomely mounted film, particularly its ominous candlelit photography and two strong performances from Isabelle Fuhrman and Stefanie Scott. However, the movie kind of left me feeling cold. I wasn't overly as involved with it as I could have been, and I don't think it's quite at the same level as the movies that it wants to emulate, especially The Witch, that it has a lot of similarities to in terms of its family dynamics and about the idea of religious repression, but The Witch, I feel, was a much more evocative movie, especially in terms of its very abstract religious imagery that was particularly bewildering and unsettling, and this movie feels a little bit too restrained, especially in its horror elements, to the point where it almost feels like it's fearful of its full potential. Hope you like the new lighting setup, by the way, and if you enjoyed this review, then you can say a prayer at my Ko-fi page, or you can open my Book of Secrets at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.